September 23, 1977. While punk rock tears through London and disco dominates American dance floors, two jazz-obsessed perfectionists in Los Angeles are about to release an album that shouldn't exist in this moment. 7 songs. 8 months of recording. Nearly 40 different musicians cycled through 6 different studios. A drummer who recorded his solo in 2 takes and then forgot he played on the track. A legendary saxophonist who almost said no. And a single guitar solo that required auditioning 8 different players before finding the right one. The album is called Aja, pronounced like the continent Asia. It will reach number 3 on the Billboard charts, sell over 5 million copies, win a Grammy, and become the gold standard for audiophile recordings for the next 5 decades. But this isn't a story about commercial success. This is a story about what happens when 2 men decide that good enough will never be good enough, and somehow convince an entire industry to fund their obsession. This is the story of Steely Dan's Aja, the album that proved perfectionism and popularity could coexist. To understand Aja, you first need to understand the men who created it. Donald Fagen and Walter Becker met in 1967 at Bard College in upstate New York. Both were jazz snobs who looked down on most rock music. Fagen was the keyboardist and singer with a voice that dripped with irony. Becker played bass and guitar with technical precision that bordered on intimidating. They formed bands with names like Leather Canary and the Bad Rock Band. Fagen later described their college sound as resembling the garage rock band The Kingsmen attempting to play Frank Zappa material. It was, by all accounts, terrible, but the partnership was magic. After graduation, they moved to New York, then to Los Angeles in 1971 when producer Gary Katz hired them as staff songwriters at ABC Records. They formed Steely Dan, named after a steam-powered device from William S. Burroughs' novel Naked Lunch, and began making albums that fused rock, jazz, R&B, and a lyrical sophistication that referenced everything from Homer's Odyssey to film noir. Their 1972 debut Can't Buy a Thrill produced 2 hit singles, but by 1974, after touring behind their 3rd album Pretzel Logic, Fagen and Becker made a radical decision: they would never tour again. The other band members were fired or left. Guitarist Jeff Baxter and drummer Jim Hodder wanted to perform live and felt insulted being replaced by session musicians. They were out. Only guitarist Denny Diaz remained as a nominal member, though even his participation would diminish. Steely Dan became something unprecedented in rock music. Not a band, but a songwriting duo using the recording studio as their instrument. They would hire whoever they needed to realize their exact vision, no matter how long it took or how many musicians they burned through. Their 1975 album Katie Lead and 1976's The Royal Scam showed increasing sophistication, but both underperformed commercially compared to Pretzel Logic. By early 1977, the pressure was on. They needed a hit, and they needed to prove their studio-only approach could work. January 1977, Fagen and Becker, along with producer Gary Katz and engineers Roger Nichols and Bill Schnee, began work on what would become their 6th studio album. They had no band, no tour plans, no obligation to make music that could be performed live. They were completely free to pursue their vision of what a perfect recording should sound like. The concept was deceptively simple. Create 7 songs that blended sophisticated jazz harmonies with pop accessibility. Each track would feature the absolute best musicians available. Every note would be meticulously crafted. Nothing would be left to chance. The reality was far more complex. Recording took place across 6 different studios in Los Angeles and New York. Producers Workshop and Village Recorder in Hollywood, Sound Labs, A&R Studios, and multiple other facilities. They worked with nearly 40 different session musicians, not simultaneously but cycling through different players until they found the exact sound they wanted. Each song underwent countless takes. Engineer Elliot Shiner later revealed that when working on tracks like Peg, entire bands would come in, record for 2 hours, and then be dismissed in favor of a completely different group the next night. It was musical chairs, but with entire rhythm sections. The budget spiraled into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, an astronomical sum for 7 songs. But ABC Records, seeing the potential for a hit, kept writing checks. Fagen and Becker had a reputation for being difficult, but musicians who worked with them tell a different story. They weren't tyrannical. They simply knew exactly what they wanted. Guitarist Steve Kahn, who played rhythm on Peg, said most direction came from Fagen, while Becker and Katz observed from the control room. Getting approval from all 3 was nearly impossible. If 2 liked a take, the third would often veto it. This wasn't cruelty. This was craft. They were chasing a sound that existed only in their heads, and they refused to settle until they heard it coming through the speakers. The title track, Aja, presented a unique challenge. At 8 minutes long, it was the longest song Steely Dan had ever attempted. The arrangement featured complex jazz chord progressions, multiple instrumental solos, and a drum break that Fagen and Becker envisioned as a centerpiece. Their regular drummers, Jeff Porcaro, Jim Keltner, were all incredible players. But none of them were right for this particular piece. The track demanded someone who could read complex charts instantly and deliver a jazz-level solo with rock intensity. Producer Gary Katz made a confession years later. For some inexplicable reason, they had never hired Steve Gadd. By 1977, Gadd was already a legend among drummers. His work on Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover had revolutionized what drum patterns could do in a pop song. He was the first call session drummer for anyone working on the sophisticated side of popular music. When they called God for the Aja session, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker weren't happy with what other drummers had produced. They needed someone who could handle the chart, which required 3 music stands per player, and improvise a solo that would match the composition's ambition. The session took place at Producers Workshop in Los Angeles. The band included bassist Chuck Rainey, guitarists Larry Carlton and Denny Diaz, pianists Joe Sample and Michael Omartian, and vibraphonist Victor Feldman. Unlike most Aja tracks, which took days or weeks to complete, the basic rhythm track for the title song came together in less than a day. Gadd sight read the entire 7-minute chart, including his solo sections, and nailed it in 2 takes. Some accounts say it was 1 take. Donald Fagen later said he was stunned. No one had ever done anything like that before. But here's where the story gets even better. A few months later, while the album was being mixed, someone mentioned that Gadd was working down the hall on a Michael Franks record. Fagen said to bring him in to hear the finished track. Gadd sat down between the studio speakers and they played Aja at full volume. When the song ended, he looked around and asked, "Who's playing drums?" He genuinely didn't remember. Katz later said Gadd was feeling good during the original session, a polite way of suggesting he'd been intoxicated. But regardless of his state, Gadd had delivered what many consider one of the finest drum performances ever recorded. His solo remains a rite of passage for jazz drummers worldwide. If Steve Gadd's drums were the heartbeat of the title track, Wayne Shorter's saxophone was its soul. By 1977, Shorter was already a jazz giant. He'd played with Miles Davis's second great quintet, co-founded the groundbreaking fusion group Weather Report, and was widely considered one of the greatest tenor saxophonists in history. He rarely worked with rock groups. Becker and Fagen specifically wanted Shorter for the extended solo in Aja, but when ABC Records president Steve Diener called him, Shorter turned them down. He wasn't interested. This is where Dick LaPalme enters the story. LaPalme owned the Village Recorder, one of the studios where Steely Dan was working. He'd known Shorter for years and had connections throughout the jazz world. When producer Gary Katz came to his office and asked if he was still tight with Wayne Shorter, LaPalme said yes. Katz explained the situation. Shorter had declined, but Fagen and Becker desperately wanted him on the album. Could LaPalme try? LaPalme called Shorter directly. They chatted for a bit, and then Lopam asked casually if Shorter would be available to come into Village Recorder that week for an overdub. Shorter agreed. When Shorter arrived at the studio, Lopam met him first. Before entering the session, Shorter asked if he could chant. Lopam sent him into Studio C. When Shorter finished his meditation, he came into Studio A where Fagen, Becker, and the engineers were waiting. According to Lopam, Fagen and Becker were dressed to impress. Donald wore a starched striped shirt, white with blue stripes, unusually formal compared to his typical studio t-shirts. They introduced themselves, played Shorter the track, and asked him to solo over it. Shorter did 6 passes. He loved the music. He was gone in 35 minutes. Becker and Fagen sat watching, stunned. After Shorter left, they spliced together portions of different passes to create the final solo that appears on the album. Shorter's playing is described by critics as otherworldly, rhapsodic, and suitable for bronzing. It's often cited as one of his finest recorded works outside pure jazz contexts. Jazz critic Ben Sidran later called the Aja recording session a moment when pop music suddenly took a turn left. The combination of Gad's explosive drumming and Shorter's soaring saxophone created something that transcended both rock and jazz. It was something entirely new. While the title track came together relatively smoothly, Peg became the album's most notorious recording challenge. Peg is just under 4 minutes long. It's a funk-influenced tune with distinctive backing vocals from Doobie Brothers singer Michael McDonald. On the surface, it sounds effortless. A catchy melody over a propulsive groove that makes you want to move. Getting there was anything but effortless. The song required a guitar solo after the first chorus. Not a long solo, maybe 15 seconds, but Fagen and Becker couldn't find anyone who could play it the way they heard it in their heads. The progression was based on blues changes, but with chromatic movements that meant traditional blues licks wouldn't work. You needed a player who understood both the blues feeling and jazz harmonic sophistication. Walter Becker tried first and didn't like his own playing. Then they started bringing in Los Angeles' finest guitarists. Accounts vary on exactly how many tried. Becker said 6 or 7 in one interview. Engineer Elliot Shiner estimated 5. Some musicians who worked on the session claim it was 8. The process took an entire week just for that one solo. Steve Kahn played the complex rhythm guitar parts on Peg, and he watched this procession with mixed feelings. Kahn later commented that having the money and guaranteed sales was essentially a license for abuse. What Steely Dan spent on 1 or 2 days trying to get a single track right, most artists could use to make an entire album. But Kahn also noted that the environment was never hostile. Walter and Donald were always searching for something new and different. The atmosphere was professional, if demanding. Musicians understood they might not make the final cut, and most took it in stride. Finally, someone recommended Jay Graydon. Graydon was a first-call Los Angeles session guitarist, though not someone Fagen and Becker had worked with before. He came in, listened to the track, and Fagen and Becker gave him remarkably little direction. They essentially said, "Let's hear what you've got." Graydon's solo opens with a bluesy double-stop phrase before shifting into a more bebop-influenced jazz feel in the second half. It was exactly what they'd been searching for. Years later, Graydon reflected on those pre-digital recording days with a mix of pride and exhaustion. You couldn't fix anything with Pro Tools. There was no help. Before Pro Tools, he said, there were pros. The final version of Peg features 11 credited musicians. The rhythm section includes drummer Rick Marotta, whose slightly open hi-hat created a subtle texture that had never been captured on record before. Michael McDonald's backing vocals float through the chorus, and that 15-second guitar solo that took a week to find sits perfectly in the mix, sounding like it was inevitable. By July 1977, 7 months after they'd started, the recording was finally complete. But the work wasn't finished. Mixing became its own marathon. Engineer Elliot Shiner thought he'd finished mixing the entire album when suddenly Fogen and Becker decided they wanted to bring in additional engineers. Al Schmidt was called in. The mixes were adjusted, revisited, refined. On the title track Aja alone, Bill Schnee noted that they had so much leakage in the room from the live recording that most everything was on one 24-track tape. In some cases, 3 or 4 different elements were on a single track, and each had to be mixed differently, verse by verse, chorus by chorus, bridge by bridge. Each section required its own setup. The album Aja has 7 songs totaling just under 40 minutes of music. To create those 40 minutes, Fogen and Becker had employed nearly 40 different session musicians, 6 different recording studios, 4 Grammy-winning engineers, countless takes on every song, hundreds of hours of studio time, a budget approaching $500,000. Session drummer Bernard Purdie played on several tracks. Bassist Chuck Rainey was on nearly everything. Pianists Joe Sample and Michael Omartian contributed. Saxophonist Pete Christlieb delivered a memorable solo on Deacon Blues. Singer Timothy B. Schmidt from the Eagles provided backing vocals on the title track. Some musicians never even made the final album. Their performances were recorded, paid for, and then set aside in favor of someone else's take. That was just how Steely Dan worked. Engineer Roger Nichols and his team pioneered recording techniques that wouldn't become standard for years. The dynamic range, clarity, and separation of instruments on Aja set a new benchmark for what studio recording could achieve. But there was a cost beyond money. Donald Fagen later developed a complex relationship with perfection. In interviews, he's admitted that listening to his own records is difficult. He always hears what could have been better. Engineer Elliot Shiner expressed similar feelings. No matter how good something sounds, a year later you think about what you might have changed. Walter Becker, meanwhile, struggled with personal demons during this period. He dealt with substance abuse issues, though he managed to keep functioning at the highest creative level. The pressure of making Aja would pale compared to what came next. Their follow-up album, Gaucho, took 3 years to complete and nearly destroyed them both. But we're getting ahead of the story. September 23, 1977, Aja was released into a music world that seemed to have no place for it. Punk rock was exploding in the UK with the Sex Pistols and The Clash. Disco ruled American dance floors with Saturday Night Fever on the horizon. Album-oriented rock was dominated by Fleetwood Mac's Rumours, which had been sitting at number 1 for months. Steely Dan's meticulously crafted jazz rock fusion seemed like a relic from another era. Music for people who read liner notes and cared about which studio the album was recorded in. And then something unexpected happened. With manager Irving Azoff's connections and aggressive promotion, Aja entered the Billboard Top 200 within 3 weeks of release. By October, it had reached number 3, becoming Steely Dan's highest charting album ever. The album spawned 3 hit singles. Peg reached number 11 on the Hot 100 in late 1977. Deacon Blues followed in early 1978, climbing to number 19. Josie, the album closer, peaked at number 26. Critics were divided. Rolling Stone's Michael Duffy wrote that Steely Dan had shifted from rock and roll toward a smoother, calculated mutation of rock, pop, and jazz idioms. He appreciated their intellectual approach, but worried it might become their fatal flaw. Village Voice critic Robert Christgau admitted he hated the record at first before realizing it was stretching him, challenging him to listen differently. But the audience didn't need convincing. Aja went platinum by December 1977, becoming one of the first albums to receive the RIAA's then-new platinum certification. It ultimately sold over 5 million copies worldwide, more than any other Steely Dan album. In the UK, where jazz rock fusion had less commercial traction, Aja still reached number 5, their highest chart position there. What was it about this album that connected despite its sophistication? Part of the answer lies in the songs themselves. Beneath all the complex arrangements and studio perfectionism, these were fundamentally great melodies with memorable hooks. You could appreciate Aja on multiple levels, as background music, as an audiophile showcase, or as a masterclass in composition and arrangement. The album was also brilliantly sequenced. It opens with Black Cow, establishing the smooth, sophisticated vibe immediately. The title track serves as the epic centerpiece. Deacon Blues provides an emotional core with its tale of dreams and disappointment. And Josie closes the album with Caribbean-influenced joy. Each track flowed into the next with careful attention to dynamics, tempo, and emotional arc. Listening to Aja straight through remains one of popular music's great experiences. February 23, 1978. The 20th Annual Grammy Awards. Aja was nominated for Album of the Year, competing against Fleetwood Mac's Rumors and the Eagles' Hotel California, two of the biggest albums of the decade. It didn't win. Rumors took home the trophy. But Aja did win Best Engineered Recording, non-classical. Engineers Roger Nichols, Al Schmidt, Elliot Shiner, and Bill Schnee all shared the award. It was recognition that the album's true achievement wasn't just the songs, but the sound itself. The album also earned nominations for Best Pop Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group. The Recording Academy understood what Steely Dan had accomplished. This was engineering and production elevated to an art form. Aja's influence rippled outward in unexpected ways. Electronic stores began using it to demonstrate high-end stereo equipment. The album became the gold standard for audiophiles. If your system couldn't make Aja sound good, something was wrong with your system, not the recording. Music journalists started citing it on greatest albums lists. Rolling Stone would eventually rank it number 145 in their 2003 list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. In 2003, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. In 2010, the Library of Congress added Aja to the National Recording Registry for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. But Fagen and Becker's perfectionism had consequences. Creating Aja nearly broke them, and their next album Gaucho would take 3 years and push them even further. During the Gaucho sessions, tragedy struck Becker repeatedly. His girlfriend died of a drug overdose in his apartment, leading to a wrongful death lawsuit. Shortly after, he was hit by a taxi and forced to use crutches while recording. The combined stress of personal trauma and creative pressure became unbearable. In 1981, after Gaucho's release, Steely Dan effectively ceased to exist. Becker moved to Hawaii and became, in his words, an avocado rancher. Fagen retreated to New York and began a solo career with the Nightfly. They wouldn't record together again for nearly 20 years. Here's what Aja proved. Perfectionism doesn't have to mean sterility. Critics in 1977 worried that Steely Dan's obsessive attention to detail would drain their music of soul, that all the multitracking and studio wizardry would create something technically impressive but emotionally empty. They were wrong. Aja remains warm, human, and deeply groovy despite, or perhaps because of, its precision. Steve Gadd's drums sound alive and spontaneous even though he was reading a chart. Wayne Shorter's saxophone solo feels transcendent, even though it was pieced together from multiple takes. The whole album breathes despite being constructed note by note in the studio. The album's legacy extends far beyond its sales figures. Aja demonstrated that jazz and rock could truly merge without either side losing its identity. Jazz historian Ted Gioia cited it as proof that pop rock could benefit from a healthy dose of jazz. The New York Times' Ben Ratliff called it a progressive jazz record with backbeats that created a new standard for the relationship between jazz and rock, one that was basically irreproducible by Steely Dan or anyone else. That irreproducibility is key. Numerous artists have tried to capture Steely Dan's sound. Some, like Snarky Puppy in the jazz world or Thundercat in modern R&B, have channeled elements of their approach, but no one has recreated the specific alchemy of Aja. The album influenced not just musicians but producers and engineers. Roger Nichols's recording techniques became studied in audio engineering programs. The way Aja was mixed, with careful attention to stereo imaging, dynamic range, and instrument separation, set standards that studios still chase today. For Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, Aja represented the peak of what they'd been trying to achieve since they met at Bard College in 1967. They'd wanted to create sophisticated jazz-influenced pop music that didn't pander or simplify. They wanted to prove you could be smart, complex, and commercially successful simultaneously. They were right. Aja reached number 3 on the charts and sold millions not despite its sophistication but partially because of it. In an era of straightforward rock and disco, audiences were hungry for something that rewarded deeper listening. The album also gave them permission to keep being difficult. After Aja's success, no record executive could tell them to make things simpler or more commercial. They'd proven their approach worked. When Fagen and Becker finally reunited in the 1990s and Steely Dan began touring again, Aja remained the centerpiece of their live shows. The title track became a showcase for contemporary musicians to attempt what Gadd and Shorter had done decades earlier. Every night a new drummer would tackle that legendary solo, and every night audiences would hold their breath. Walter Becker passed away in September 2017 at age 67. Donald Fagen continues touring under the Steely Dan name, though reluctantly. He said he wanted to retire the name out of respect for his partner, but promoters advised against it for commercial reasons. So the music continues, and Aja endures, not as a relic of 1970s excess or as a curiosity for jazz nerds, but as a testament to what's possible when two people refuse to compromise their vision and somehow convince the world to listen. Listen to those opening piano chords of Black Cow. Hear Steve Gadd's sticks clicking at the end of his drum solo. Feel Wayne Shorter's saxophone reaching for something beyond words. Notice how Jay Graydon's guitar phrases in Peg seem to unlock the whole song. These aren't accidents. These are choices. Hundreds of choices, made across 8 months in 6 different studios by 2 men who believed that good enough would never be good enough. Aja taught musicians that perfectionism and soul could coexist. It showed audiences that complexity didn't mean inaccessibility. And it proved to the music industry that craft still mattered. That spending time, money, and effort on getting things right could still yield commercial and artistic success. In a world of one-take wonders and first-draft hits, Aja stands as a monument to the opposite philosophy. That great art comes from revision, refinement, and the relentless pursuit of that sound you hear in your head, but can't quite capture. Until suddenly, after the 40th take, the 8th guitarist, the 6th studio, you do capture it, and then it lives forever.